At 11:28 a.m. on a quiet Saturday morning, the seismographs in Norway spiked with the sudden violence of a small earthquake located deep beneath the Barents Sea. A chemical reaction hot enough to melt high-grade steel was already tearing through the forward compartment of the Pride of the Russian Navy. In a fraction of a second, the concept of unsinkable was erased by fire. The date was August 12, 2000, and the mood in the Northern Fleet was one of cautious optimism. For the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union a decade earlier, the Russian Navy had assembled a force worthy of a superpower. The exercise was designated Summer X. It was a massive display of maritime strength involving 30 ships, 3 submarines, and a flotilla of support vessels maneuvering through the gray, choppy waters north of the Arctic Circle. This was not merely a drill, it was a statement to the world that the Russian bear had returned to the ocean. At the center of this formation, acting as the crown jewel of the fleet, was the nuclear-powered submarine K-141 Kursk. To call the Kursk a submarine is almost an understatement. She was an underwater cruiser, a leviathan of the Oscar II classes designed with a singular, terrifying purpose: to hunt and destroy American aircraft carrier battle groups. She stretched 505 feet from bow to stern, longer than 2 Boeing 747s parked nose to tail. When submerged, she displaced nearly 19,000 tons of water, making her twice the size of the largest American attack submarines of the era. She was built to be invincible. Her design featured a double hull, a ship-within-a-ship architecture. The outer hull was separated from the inner pressure hull by a gap of several feet, a buffer zone filled with water and equipment designed to absorb the shock of an enemy torpedo. She was clad in inches of acoustic rubber to absorb sonar pings. She carried 24 P-700 Granite cruise missiles, massive weapons capable of carrying nuclear warheads to targets 300 miles away. She was a technological titan, a symbol of national resilience, and the home of 118 men. On the morning of August 12th, the Kursk was prowling at periscope depth, preparing to execute a simulated attack on the flagship of the fleet, the nuclear battlecruiser Peter the Great. The exercise called for the Kursk to fire a dummy torpedo, a practice weapon with no warhead, to demonstrate her readiness. The crew in the forward torpedo room, Compartment 1, was busy preparing the weapon. The torpedo selected for the drill was a Type 6576, known to the sailors as the Kit or Whale. It was a colossal weapon, 26 inches in diameter and 36 feet long. It was designed to track the wake of an aircraft carrier from 60 miles away. But the Type 65 had a controversial history. Unlike Western torpedoes, which typically used electric batteries or auto fuel, the Type 65 was powered by a chemical cocktail involving high-test peroxide, or HTP. HTP is a highly concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide. It is an incredibly efficient oxidizer, allowing the torpedo to travel at high speeds for long distances without leaving a visible wake. However, it is also chemically temperamental. In its pure form, HTP is stable, but if it comes into contact with certain catalytic impurities, rust, copper, or bronze, it reacts violently. It expands in volume by 5,000 times almost instantly, transforming from a liquid into a superheated gas of steam and oxygen. The British Royal Navy had experimented with HTP torpedoes in the 1950s but abandoned the technology after an explosion aboard the HMS Sidon killed 13 men. They deemed the fuel too dangerous to store on a warship. The Russian Navy, however, continued to use it. It was cheaper than the alternatives and offered the performance they needed to counter American naval superiority. The Kursk was carrying a practice torpedo that had been manufactured 10 years earlier. It had never been fired. Inside the torpedo tube, unseen by the crew, a microscopic failure was occurring. A faulty weld in the torpedo's casing, or perhaps a degraded seal, began to leak. The high-test peroxide seeped out of its reservoir. It trickled onto the metal interior of the tube or the torpedo casing itself. It found a catalyst. At 11:28 a.m. and 27 seconds, the chemical reaction reached critical mass. The HTP expanded with the force of a bomb. The pressure inside the torpedo tube skyrocketed, rupturing the weapon's kerosene fuel tank. The mixture of oxygen-rich steam and kerosene ignited instantly. The resulting explosion was estimated to be equivalent to roughly 200 to 500 pounds of TNT. The blast blew the outer door of the torpedo tube off its hinges, sending it spinning into the sea. But tragically, the inner door, the one facing the interior of the submarine, also failed. The fireball did not vent harmlessly into the ocean. It vented backward, into compartment 1. The effect was catastrophic. The explosion incinerated the 7 men working in the torpedo room instantly. The shockwave slammed through the open ventilation ducts that connected compartment 1 to compartment 2, the command center of the submarine. In the control room, the captain, the executive officer, and the senior specialists were likely incapacitated or killed within seconds of the first blast. The Kursk was now a runaway train. Without a command crew to blow the ballast tanks or maneuver the ship, the massive submarine began to dip by the bow. She plowed forward, her engines still turning, driving her deeper into the Barents Sea. Inside the shattered nose of the boat, a fire was raging. This was not a normal fire. It was fueled by the oxygen generated from the decomposing peroxide. The temperature in the torpedo room climbed rapidly, reaching nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot enough to melt the steel ribs of the hull. But worse, the fire was burning around the other weapons stored on the racks. The Kursk carried a full load of combat torpedoes. These were not dummies. They were live weapons, packed with high explosives. The heat from the initial fire cooked the warheads. The metal casings of the neighboring torpedoes began to glow, then soften, then fail. 2 minutes and 15 seconds after the first explosion, the second catastrophe occurred. At 11:30 a.m. and 15 seconds, the warheads of 5 to 7 torpedoes detonated simultaneously. This was not a minor chemical burst. This was a massive geological event. The combined force of the warheads was equivalent to somewhere between 2 and 3 tons of TNT. It was a blast powerful enough to register on seismic sensors as far away as Alaska. The force of the second explosion was devastating. It tore the entire bow section of the submarine apart. A hole measuring 22 square feet was ripped through the double hull. The thick steel plating, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, was peeled back like tin foil. The bulkhead separating the torpedo room from the command center was obliterated. The shockwave traveled backward through the ship like a piston. It smashed through compartment 2, destroying the control room completely. It tore through compartment 3, the radio and electronics room. It hammered against the heavy reactor bulkhead. The Kursk shuddered violently. The force of the explosion halted her forward momentum. She became a dead weight, dropping through the cold, dark water. She hit the seabed of the Barents Sea at a depth of 354 feet. She landed relatively level with a slight list to the port side. A plume of silt and mud rose up to swallow the wounded giant. The silence of the ocean returned, masking the inferno that had just consumed the front third of the vessel. On the surface, the fleet continued its maneuvers. The commanders on the Peter the Great felt the shudder of the explosion through the water. The hydroacoustic operators heard the noise, but in the confusion of a live fire exercise, assumption clouded judgment. Some officers believed the sound was the result of a depth charge drill or a supersonic boom from an aircraft. No distress signal had been sent. The Kursk's radio room had been destroyed before a mayday could be tapped out. For hours, the fleet carried on, unaware that their flagship submarine was lying broken on the bottom. The protocol for the exercise stated that the Kursk was to check in via radio once the dummy attack was complete. The designated time came and went. 1:00 p.m. passed. No contact. 3:00 p.m. passed. No contact. It was not until the early evening that the reality began to settle in. The Kursk was not just silent, she was missing. The confident swagger of the morning evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread in the headquarters of the Northern Fleet. The unsinkable ship had not surfaced. The physics of the disaster were brutal and absolute. The kinetic energy released by the second explosion was enough to destroy any vessel ever built. The engineering marvel of the Oscar II class, with its double hull and acoustic tiling, had been undone by the chemistry of its own ammunition. The tragedy was compounded by the shallow depth of the Barents Sea. Had the water been deeper, the hull might have been crushed completely by the pressure. But at 354 feet, the pressure was survivable for the aft compartments. The submarine was effectively divided into 2 worlds. The forward compartments, 1, 2, 3, and 4, were a ruin of twisted metal, fire, and water. Everyone forward of the nuclear reactors was dead. but the reactors themselves, housed in Compartment 5, held. The heavy shielding and the automated safety systems performed a final, heroic service. The control rods dropped, the reactors shut down. The nuclear heart of the ship stopped beating, preventing a meltdown that would have turned the Barents Sea into a radioactive exclusion zone. But behind the reactors, in the stern of the boat, the hull was intact. The shockwave had dissipated as it traveled through the length of the ship. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim glow of emergency lighting. The air grew still. The temperature began to drop. The Kursk was a tomb, but it was not yet empty of life. The sinking of the Kursk was a collision between the ambitions of a superpower and the unforgiving laws of physics. It revealed the fragility of complex systems. A single weld on a single torpedo had triggered a chain reaction that humbled a navy. As the sun set over the Arctic horizon, the rescue ships began to turn their searchlights toward the water. The seismic data was already being analyzed in Norway and the United States. The world was beginning to realize that something terrible had happened. But the full scope of the horror was hidden beneath 300 feet of water. The Titan had fallen. The pride of the fleet was broken. And as the cold water settled around the steel carcass, the story was no longer about naval supremacy or geopolitical posturing. It was about survival. In the shattered silence that follows the explosions, a new, chilling reality descends upon the surviving crew of the Kursk. The initial blasts, powerful enough to register on distant seismic stations, have ripped through the forward sections of the submarine. But in the stern compartments, a desperate struggle for survival begins. The lights have flickered out, replaced by the eerie glow of emergency batteries and the creeping cold of the Barents Sea. The Kursk lies on the seabed, a massive steel carcass, 354 feet down. The front 5 compartments, from the torpedo room through the reactor section, are a ruin. The forward escape hatch is jammed shut, twisted by the force of the explosions. The radio room is destroyed, cutting off any hope of sending a distress signal. But in the aft sections, the double hull design has done its job. Compartments 6 through 9, including the turbine room and the escape trunk, remain largely intact. In Compartment 9, the furthest aft compartment of the submarine, 23 men survived the initial explosions. This is the heart of the ship's engineering, a labyrinth of pipes, valves, and heavy machinery. Among them is Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, a 27-year-old officer and one of the most senior men to escape the blast. He is a submariner by trade, trained to deal with the chaos of damage control and the grim calculus of underwater survival. The air in Compartment 9 is thick with smoke and the metallic tang of burnt wiring. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, highlighting the grim expressions on the faces of the survivors. They know they are on the bottom. They know the forward sections are gone. They know they are trapped. Their first priority is to seal off the compartment. They dog down the heavy watertight hatches, securing them against the creeping cold of the Barents Sea. They activate the regeneration cartridges, devices designed to scrub carbon dioxide from the air and release oxygen. For a short time, they have breathable air and enough power for limited lighting. But the struggle against the cold and the darkness is relentless. The internal temperature begins to drop as the ambient cold of the Barents Sea permeates the hull. The men huddle together for warmth, their heavy woolen uniforms offering little protection against the creeping chill. Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov understands the gravity of their situation. He knows that rescue from this depth is incredibly difficult. He knows that his men need hope, and they need a record of their final moments. In the flickering light, he finds a piece of paper and a pencil. He begins to write. His note is a raw, heartbreaking document. He records the time 13:15. All personnel from compartments 6, 7, and 8 move to compartment 9. He lists the names of the 23 men who are still alive. He describes the conditions. There are 23 people here. We made this decision as a result of the accident. It's dark here. He signs his name, Dmitry Kolesnikov, and adds the grim, defiant words, "We are still alive." This note, later recovered, becomes the voice of the Kursk survivors, a testament to their courage in the face of absolute despair. It reveals that the men were not immediately killed. They lived for hours, perhaps even days, cut off from the world, fighting for every breath. On the surface, the Russian Northern Fleet has finally realized the scale of the disaster. The massive search operation begins. Ships crisscross the Barents Sea, their sonar pinging frantically, trying to locate the wreck. The initial confusion about drill sounds gives way to a grim determination. But the Russian rescue capabilities are severely degraded after a decade of underfunding. The specialized rescue submersibles designed to mate with a submarine's escape trunk and extract survivors are old and poorly maintained. The pilots are out of practice. The weather in the Barents Sea is notoriously fickle, and the choppy waters make delicate underwater operations incredibly difficult. The first attempts are a series of heartbreaking failures. The Russian mini-submarines, like the Priz AS-34, make repeated dives to the wreck site. They try to lock onto the escape hatch in compartment 9, but the currents are too strong. The mating skirts of the submersibles are damaged. The hatches on the Kursk are slightly warped by the explosion, preventing a secure seal. The Priz bumps repeatedly against the hull, its crew straining against the controls, but it cannot make a stable connection. Adding to the confusion and secrecy, the Russian government is initially reluctant to admit the true extent of the disaster. President Vladimir Putin is on vacation, and the initial reports from the Navy are vague and contradictory. The official line is that the Kursk is experiencing technical difficulties and that rescue efforts are underway. There is no mention of explosions or severe damage. This culture of concealment, a hangover from the Soviet era, proves fatal. The Russian Navy initially refuses international assistance. The British and Norwegian governments, observing the chaotic and ultimately futile Russian attempts, immediately offer their help. They have modern deep-sea rescue equipment, trained crews, and proven technology. The Russian admirals, however, are trapped by pride and protocol. To accept Western help would be to admit weakness, a humiliation in the eyes of their former Cold War adversaries. Inside compartment 9, the air is growing foul. The oxygen regeneration cartridges have a finite lifespan. As the hours turn into days, the carbon dioxide levels in the air begin to climb, slowly poisoning the men. The fire in the forward compartments, though dampened by the seawater, continues to smolder, releasing toxic fumes that seep backward through the damaged bulkheads. The water is also slowly rising. The pressure hull, while largely intact, is not perfect. Small leaks develop. The cold black water of the Barents Sea begins to seep into compartment 9, mixing with the oily residue from the engines. The men are forced to stand in freezing water, their bodies shivering uncontrollably, their minds growing sluggish from the lack of oxygen and the increasing levels of CO2. Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov writes a second note scrawled on the back of his first. This one is even more chilling. He dates it August 12, 2000, 23:45. He writes, "It's too dark to write here, but I'll try by touch. It seems there's no chance, 10-20%. He describes the spread of smoke, the lack of light, the desperation. He ends with a haunting message. Greetings to everyone. No need to despair. This note proves that the men survived for at least 6 hours after the initial explosions. Some analysis suggests they may have lived for several days, clinging to life as the oxygen slowly depleted and the cold water slowly flooded their refuge. On the surface, the international community is growing increasingly alarmed. News of the disaster, initially suppressed by Russia, leaks to the Western media. Headlines scream about the missing nuclear submarine and the trapped sailors. The families of the crew, now gathered in Murmansk, are desperate for information. They confront naval officers demanding answers. The Russian government faces immense pressure from within and without to accept international assistance. Finally, after nearly 4 days of failed attempts and facing a public relations disaster of epic proportions, President Putin gives the order. Russia formally requests help from Great Britain and Norway. A British remotely operated vehicle, ROV, and Norwegian divers are rushed to the site, but time has run out. The British ROV, equipped with powerful lights and high-definition cameras, is the first to make a positive identification of the Kursk's escape hatch. The images it sends back are grim. The hatch is severely damaged, twisted, and buckled, making it impossible for any submersible to mate with it. The Norwegian divers, working in shifts in the freezing water, manage to open the escape hatch to compartment 9. They insert a probe. The sensor reads nothing. The compartment is filled with water. The air inside is toxic. There are no signs of life. The news is relayed to the surface. On August 21, 2000, 9 days after the explosions, the Russian Northern Fleet officially declares all 118 men lost. The international rescue effort, so quickly mobilized, has arrived too late. The men of the Kursk died alone, fighting for breath, sending their final defiant messages into the dark. The initial phase of the tragedy is over. The immediate human cost has been paid. But the geopolitical fallout is just beginning. The conspiracy theories immediately start to swirl. The Russian public, distrustful of their government, refuses to accept the official explanation of an internal accident. They demand answers. The government, in turn, fueled by old Cold War suspicions, begins to float its own theories. They suggest that the Kursk was not sunk by a faulty torpedo, but by an external force. They hint at a foreign collision, perhaps with a NATO submarine that was shadowing the exercise. The propaganda machine cranks into gear, attempting to deflect blame and restore national pride. The wreck of the Kursk now sits on the seabed, a massive steel tomb containing not just the bodies of its crew, but also 2 nuclear reactors, 22 unexploded granite cruise missiles, and a deeply fractured national psyche. The notes from Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov, recovered later when the submarine is raised, will become a poignant testament to the human spirit in the face of despair. But for now, they are hidden in the dark along with the truth. The deep-sea silence that followed the explosions is now broken by the roar of public outrage and the whisper of suspicion. The Kursk has become more than a submarine. She has become a symbol. In the weeks following the official declaration of death for the 118 men of the Kursk, a different kind of fog settles over the Barents Sea. It is not a meteorological phenomenon, but a dense, suffocating cloud of suspicion, rumor, and geopolitical paranoia. The grief of the families in the garrison town of Vidyayevo has turned into a cold, hard anger, and that anger demands a villain. The official explanation that a faulty torpedo caused a chemical fire feels too mundane, too accidental for a tragedy of this magnitude. In the Russian psyche, battered by a decade of economic collapse and military humiliation, the loss of their most advanced warship cannot simply be a matter of bad welding or degraded peroxide. It has to be something else. It has to be an attack. The environment for conspiracy is perfect. The Summer X exercise was not happening in a vacuum. It was the largest projection of Russian naval power in a decade, and consequently, it had attracted a crowded audience. The Barents Sea in August 2000 was teeming with underwater observers. It is an open secret in the world of submarine warfare that whenever the Russian Navy leaves port in force, the Western navies are shadowing them. This is the silent service game, a cat-and-mouse routine practiced since the height of the Cold War. American and British attack submarines patrol the edges of the exercise boxes, sitting quietly in the thermal layers, recording acoustic signatures, intercepting communications, and gathering intelligence on new Russian tactics. During the Kursk disaster, there were at least 3 NATO submarines in the immediate vicinity. The American Los Angeles-class submarines USS Memphis and USS Toledo, and the British Swift-Shurus-class submarine HMS Splendid. Their presence is not a conspiracy theory, it is a documented fact of naval operations. But in the fevered atmosphere of late 2000, this proximity becomes the seed of a dangerous narrative. High-ranking Russian naval officers, including the commander of the Northern Fleet, Admiral Vyacheslav Popov, publicly float the theory of a collision. They suggest that one of the NATO submarines, maneuvering aggressively to get a better acoustic angle on the Kursk, accidentally rammed the Russian giant. The physics of a submarine collision are terrifying. If a 7,000-ton American submarine struck the 19,000-ton Kursk at speed, the impact would be catastrophic. The theory posits that such a collision ruptured the Kursk's forward hull or torpedo tubes, triggering the explosions that sent her to the bottom. This narrative gains traction rapidly. It offers a convenient external enemy. It shifts the blame from Russian maintenance failures to Western aggression. Russian media outlets begin to circulate grainy satellite photographs purporting to show a damaged American submarine limping into a Norwegian port for emergency repairs. Reports surface of a mysterious green emergency buoy found near the wreck site, green being a color used by NATO, while Russian buoys are typically red and white. The USS Memphis becomes the primary suspect in the court of public opinion. Rumors fly that she arrived in Bergen, Norway, days after the disaster with significant damage to her bow. The story is compelling, dramatic, and geopolitically explosive. If true, it means the United States effectively sank a Russian nuclear submarine, an act that could be interpreted as a cause for war. But as the emotional dust settles, the cold logic of forensics and physics begins to dismantle the collision theory piece by piece. The first problem is mass. The Kursk was a leviathan, a double-hulled fortress of steel and rubber displacing nearly twice the water of an American Los Angeles-class boat. In a high-speed collision, the laws of momentum dictate that the smaller vessel would suffer catastrophic, likely fatal damage. If the USS Memphis or Toledo had hit the Kursk hard enough to tear open her pressure hull or detonate her torpedoes, the American submarine would not have limped away. It would be lying on the bottom of the Barents Sea, right next to the Kursk. The damage to the NATO submarines would have been total. A collision at periscope depth or submerged speeds involves thousands of tons of steel meeting instantly. The American submarine would have suffered a crushed bow, a ruptured pressure hull, and likely a loss of containment. Yet the USS Memphis did arrive in Norway for a scheduled port visit, and while there were rumors of damage, independent observers and subsequent photographs showed a submarine with its hull intact. A submarine that had just rammed an underwater cruiser would not be structurally sound enough to surface and sail into a friendly harbor for tea. The second problem is the seismic data. The Norwegian Seismic Array, NORSAR, recorded two distinct events on August 12th. The first was a sharp, smaller spike. The second, occurring 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, was a massive tremor. A collision is a single kinetic event. It is metal hitting metal. It produces a specific acoustic signature, a crunch, followed by the noise of breaking structure. It does not produce a chemical explosion followed 2 minutes later by a multi-ton warhead detonation. The seismic record clearly shows an explosion, a pause, and then a much larger explosion. This timeline aligns perfectly with the theory of a torpedo fire leading to a sympathetic detonation of the magazine. It does not fit the profile of a collision. Furthermore, the green buoy rumor is investigated and dismisses. The buoy found was likely a piece of fishing gear or debris unrelated to the submarine. The NATO navies, usually tight-lipped, take the extraordinary step of issuing formal denials. They acknowledge their presence in the area but categorically state that no collision took place. However, proving a negative is difficult in the world of intelligence. The conspiracy theories linger because they serve a political purpose. They allow the Russian Admiralty to save face. They channel the grief of the families into anger at a foreign power, rather than at the system that sent their sons to sea in a neglected ship. But while the politicians and pundits argue about spies and collisions, a much darker and more tangible reality is sitting on the seabed. The Kursk is not just a crime scene, it is an environmental time bomb. The submarine is powered by two OK-650B nuclear reactors. Together, they contain a massive inventory of uranium fuel rods and highly radioactive fission products. When the submarine sank, the automatic safety system successfully scrammed the reactors. The control rods dropped, halting the nuclear chain reaction. But a shutdown reactor is not a cold reactor. The fuel rods continue to generate decay heat for months. They rely on the natural circulation of coolant within the reactor vessel to keep from melting down. The Kursk is lying on the bottom, subjected to the crushing pressure of the ocean and the corrosive effects of salt water. If the reactor vessel is breached, or if the coolant lines corrode and fail, the radioactive material could leak into the Barents Sea. This is not just a desolate patch of ocean, it is one of the most productive fisheries in the world. It is the breeding ground for cod and herring stocks that feed millions of people across Europe and Russia. A significant radiological leak would be an ecological catastrophe, poisoning the food chain for decades. Moreover, the wreck still contains the 22 remaining P-700 Granite cruise missiles. These are 40-foot-long monsters, each carrying a 1,600-pound conventional warhead. While the torpedoes in the bow destroyed themselves, the missiles in the silos along the sides of the submarine are likely intact. They are unstable, damaged by the shock of the explosion and the impact with the bottom. They represent tons of high explosives sitting in a fragile steel container. And then there are the bodies. 118 men are entombed in the steel hull. For the families in Vidyayevo and across Russia, the thought of their sons, husbands, and fathers lying in the cold dark is an open wound. In Russian Orthodox tradition, a proper burial is essential for the peace of the soul. Leaving the crew on the bottom of the sea is culturally and emotionally unacceptable. The pressure from the families is relentless. They do not care about the cost. They do not care about the technical difficulties. They want their boys home. By the end of 2000, the fog of suspicion begins to lift just enough to reveal the stark choice facing the Russian leadership. They can leave the Kursk where she is, a monument to failure and a permanent environmental hazard, or they can attempt the impossible. The decision to raise the Kursk is not made lightly. It is a gamble of immense proportions. The Russian Navy does not have the technology to do it alone. Their heavy lift capabilities have atrophied since the fall of the Soviet Union. To raise the submarine, they will have to swallow their national pride and ask for help from the very nations they were training to fight. They will have to turn to the West. The project will require engineering on a scale never before attempted. It will require cutting a nuclear submarine in half at the bottom of the ocean. It will require lifting a weight equivalent to 25 fully loaded Boeing 747s. And it will require doing all of this in the unpredictable, storm-tossed waters of the Arctic, with the world watching every move. President Putin, facing the first major crisis of his presidency, makes the call. The Kursk will be raised. The mission is defined by 3 objectives: to remove the environmental threat of the reactors, to recover the unexploded missiles, and most importantly, to bring the crew home. The conspiracy theories slowly fade into the background, replaced by the pragmatic and terrifying reality of the engineering challenge ahead. The foreign collision narrative remains a ghost story told in naval bars, but the focus shifts to the Dutch engineers and heavy lift specialists who are about to receive a phone call from Moscow. The stage is set for one of the most complex salvage operations in maritime history. The fog of war is clearing, but the heavy lifting is just beginning. The Kursk is waiting, heavy and silent, and she will not give up her dead easily. As the winter of 2001 releases its grip on the Arctic, the Russian government faces a reckoning that is as much psychological as it is logistical. The decision to raise the Kursk has been made. President Vladimir Putin, acutely aware of the anger simmering in the garrison towns of the Kola Peninsula, has promised the families that their sons will be brought home. He has promised the world that the nuclear hazard sitting on the continental shelf will be removed. But making a promise and keeping it are 2 very different things in the post-Soviet reality. The Russian Navy, once the master of the deep ocean, finds itself technologically paralyzed. Their salvage fleet is a shadow of its former self. They possess deep-diving submersibles and heavy-duty tugs, but they lack the specific, specialized technology required for a lift of this magnitude. Raising a vessel that weighs nearly 20,000 tons from a depth of 350 feet requires more than just cables and winches. It requires a level of precision engineering that the Russian military-industrial complex, starved of funds for a decade, simply cannot invent in a few months. The Admiralty looks at the problem and realizes they have 2 options. They can attempt a domestic recovery using pontoons and airbags, a chaotic and risky method that could result in the submarine breaking apart and spilling its nuclear guts into the sea. Or they can do the unthinkable. They can hire the West. In a twist of historical irony that would have been unimaginable just 10 years earlier, the Russian government issues a tender to international salvage companies. They are inviting the citizens of NATO nations, the very people the Kursk was designed to destroy, to come and rescue her. The contract is not just a business deal, it is a diplomatic high-wire act. The Russian military is paranoid about secrecy. The Kursk is still a treasure trove of classified technology. Her granite missiles, her sonar-absorbing tiles, and her cryptographic equipment are all top secret. Letting Western engineers get close enough to touch the hull, let alone lift it, goes against every instinct of the Russian security services. But physics does not care about security clearances. The need for heavy lift capability outweighs the need for secrecy. 2 Dutch companies rise to the challenge, forming a consortium that brings together the best of maritime salvage and heavy lifting. The first is Smit International, a legendary salvage firm based in Rotterdam. These are the men who tow oil rigs through hurricanes and refloat tankers that have run aground. They understand the ocean, they understand diving, they understand the violence of the sea. The second partner is Mammoet. Unlike Smit, Mammoet is not a maritime company. They are land-based heavy lifters. They are the people you call when you need to move a cathedral, lift a bridge span, or transport a petrochemical refinery. They specialize in moving massive, immovable objects with millimeter precision. Together, they propose a radical solution. They will not use cranes. Cranes on a floating barge are too unstable. The motion of the waves would cause the load to swing, snapping the cables. They will not use giant airbags, which are too unpredictable. Instead, Mammoth proposes using a system of hydraulic strand jacks mounted on a giant pontoon barge. Strand jacks are typically used in construction to lift heavy roofs or bridge sections. They work like hands pulling on a rope, gripping a bundle of steel cables, pulling them up a few feet, locking them off, resetting, and pulling again. It is a slow, incredibly controlled method of lifting that eliminates the bouncing and swinging of a crane. The plan is audacious. They will modify a massive barge, the Giant 4, to serve as the lifting platform. They will lower 26 heavy lifting cables down to the submarine. They will attach these cables to the hull using a custom-designed gripping anchor that expands inside the submarine's structural ribs. And then, using the computer-controlled jacks, they will lift the entire 19,000-ton vessel in one seamless motion, pulling it up until it is tucked tightly against the bottom of the barge. But there is a catch, a massive, terrifying catch. The bow of the Kursk is a ruin. The explosions in August 2000 shattered the structural integrity of the first compartment. The nose of the submarine is a tangled mess of torn steel, barely attached to the rest of the ship. It hangs by twisted girders and shredded plating. The engineers at Mammoet and Smith realize that they cannot lift the submarine in one piece. If they try to pull the Kursk off the seabed, the damaged bow might break off. If it snaps during the lift, the sudden shift in weight could destabilize the barge, potentially sinking the recovery vessel. Worse, the bow is filled with unexploded torpedoes. If the trauma of the lift triggers another detonation, the shockwave would destroy the lifting equipment and kill the salvage crew. The solution they propose is surgical and brutal. Before they can lift the Kursk, they have to cut off its head. They propose to slice the submarine in two, severing the damaged bow from the rest of the hull just behind the torpedo compartment. They will leave the dangerous, mangled nose on the seabed and lift only the intact section containing the reactors and the crew. The Russian admirals are hesitant. Cutting through the tough steel hull of an Oscar II-class submarine is not easy. This is steel designed to withstand the pressure of diving to 1,600 feet. It is high-yield, high-strength alloy coated in inches of tough rubber. And they have to cut it remotely, at the bottom of the Barents Sea, in water with zero visibility, without detonating the missiles that sit just a few feet away from the cut line. Despite the risks, the contract is signed in May 2001. The clock immediately starts ticking. The Barents Sea is only workable for a few months of the year. By October, the winter storms will return, making operations impossible. They have 5 months to design, build, and test equipment that has never existed before, and then execute the most complex salvage in history. The mobilization is frantic. In the Netherlands, Mammoet engineers begin modifying the Giant 4. This barge is not a ship, it is a floating platform, 460 feet long. They have to reinforce the deck to hold the weight of the submarine. They install 26 massive hydraulic jacks, each capable of pulling 900 tons. They build a recess, a concave shape on the bottom of the barge, that will cradle the submarine's conning tower so it fits snugly against the hull. Meanwhile, Smith International begins working on the cutting technology. They cannot use torches. The depth and the risk of explosion make fire impossible. They decide to use a method adapted from the stone quarrying industry, diamond wire cutting. They will build a massive robotic saw. It will look like a giant chain, threaded with sleeves of industrial diamonds. This chain will be looped around the submarine's hull. Hydraulic motors will pull the wire back and forth, grinding through the steel, the rubber, and the ribs like a garrote slicing through cheese. The scale of the equipment is staggering. The cutting system alone involves 2 massive suction anchors, huge steel cylinders that will be sucked into the mud on either side of the submarine to hold the pulleys in place. The diamond wire will have to cut through a hull that is not a simple tube, but a complex shape of double walls, pipes, and bulkheads. While the Dutch build the hardware, the Russians handle the diplomacy of the dead. The families of the crew are informed of the plan. They are told that the bow, where the torpedo men died instantly, will be left behind for now. It is a painful compromise, but one necessary to save the rest. The unlikely alliance between the Russian military and Western corporate engineering is fraught with tension. The Russians are suspicious. They demand that Russian observers be present at every stage. They insist that the Western divers must not enter the submarine. The secrets inside, the cryptographic gear, the missile guidance systems are to remain strictly in Russian hands. The Dutch companies agree. They are there to lift steel, not to spy. But the line is thin. To lift the submarine, they need the blueprints. They need to know the center of gravity. They need to know the thickness of the hull. For the first time, the Russian Navy is forced to hand over the technical schematics of their most prized warship to civilians from NATO countries. As the summer of 2001 approaches, the fleet begins to assemble. It is a strange armada. There is the Giant 4, the massive yellow and red barge. There is the Mayo, a diving support vessel. There are Russian warships standing guard, their radars sweeping the horizon to ensure no curious American submarines get too close. The atmosphere is heavy with the weight of the task. This is not just a salvage job, it is a funeral procession in reverse. If they fail, if the wire snaps, if the jacks fail, if the nuclear reactor leaks, the reputation of everyone involved will be destroyed. For the engineers at Mammoet, the pressure is tied to the physics of the breakout. When a submarine sits on the bottom of the ocean for a year, it settles. The mud creates a suction seal. Lifting it is not just a matter of lifting the weight of the steel. You have to break the suction. The force required to pull the Kursk out of the mud is estimated to be significantly higher than its actual weight. They calculate they will need a breakout force of nearly 3,000 tons just to overcome the grip of the seabed. It is the moment of maximum danger. If the suction breaks suddenly, the submarine could jump up, slamming into the lifting barge and causing a catastrophic whiplash effect on the cables. To mitigate this, the computer systems controlling the jacks are programmed with complex algorithms to sense the load and adjust the pull millisecond by millisecond. It is a dance of hydraulics and gravity, played out with millions of pounds of force. By July 2001, the equipment is ready. The Giant 4 is towed out of Amsterdam. The cutting equipment is loaded. The divers are briefed. The world is watching. The Barents Sea waits gray and cold. It has held the Kursk for a year. Now, a team of Dutch engineers and Russian sailors are coming to take her back. The alliance is formed, the contracts are signed, the technology is built. But as the fleet moves north, crossing the Arctic Circle, the ghost of the previous August hangs over them. They are going back to the scene of the crime. They are going to disturb a grave, and they are doing it with a robotic saw and a barge full of jacks, attempting a feat that many naval architects still whisper is impossible. In July 2001, the International Armada arrives at the coordinates 69°40'37°35'E. To the casual observer, the Barents Sea looks the same as it always does, a vast, heaving expanse of slate-gray water under a sky that refuses to get truly dark. The midnight sun of the Arctic summer hangs on the horizon, bathing the fleet in a perpetual, eerie twilight. But beneath the surface, the environment is anything but static. The currents are strong, the water is barely above freezing, and the seabed is a graveyard waiting to be disturbed. The recovery fleet is a strange congregation of purpose-built vessels. At the center sits the Mayo, a diving support ship operated by the Dutch company DSND. It is the nerve center of the underwater operation, packed with saturation diving chambers, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and the control systems for the cutting equipment. Nearby hovers the Giant 4, the massive barge modified by Mammoet, waiting for its moment to lift. Circling them like wolves are the gray warships of the Russian Northern Fleet, their radars spinning, ensuring that this humanitarian and engineering mission does not become an intelligence bonanza for NATO. The task ahead is surgical in nature but industrial in scale. Before the Kursk can be lifted, it must be prepared. This is not as simple as hooking a chain around a log. The submarine is a smooth, hydrodynamic cylinder designed to slip through the water, not to be grabbed. There are no handlebars on a nuclear submarine. The engineers have to create them. The first phase of the operation involves the installation of the lifting points. The plan calls for 26 holes to be cut into the pressure hull of the submarine, pairings of holes located between the structural ribs of the ship. Into these holes, the divers will insert massive steel grippers known as plugs. These plugs work on the same principle as a drywall anchor, but infinitely stronger. Once inserted into the hole, the wings of the plug will expand outward, locking against the underside of the ultra-strong pressure hull. When the giant 4 begins to pull, the entire weight of the 19,000-ton vessel will hang from these 26 points of contact. If the steel tears or if the plugs slip, the Kursk will fall back to the bottom, likely shattering the reactor compartment. The work falls to the saturation divers. These are the elite of the commercial diving world. For weeks, they live inside pressurized chambers on the deck of the Mayo, breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen. They are transported to the seabed in a diving bell, commuting to work 350 feet down. Their voices are distorted into a high-pitched Donald Duck squeak by the helium, but their communication is deadly serious. They work in a world of shadows. The lights from the bell and their helmets cut through the gloom, illuminating the black, rubber-coated skin of the Kursk. The submarine looms out of the darkness like a sleeping beast. The divers can see the damage from the explosion, the torn metal, the debris field, but they have to ignore it. They focus on the drill. Drilling through the hull of an Oscar II-class submarine is a nightmare. First, they have to penetrate the outer hull. Then, they encounter the acoustic rubber tiles. This rubber is designed to absorb sonar energy, but it also absorbs drill bits. It melts, gums up the cutting heads, and resists penetration. Behind the rubber lies the inner pressure hull, made of high-yield steel alloy that was specifically formulated to defeat the weapons of the West. Now, Western tools have to defeat the steel. Using high-pressure water jets and specialized cutting tools, the divers carve the 26 holes with agonizing precision. Each hole must be perfectly round and positioned exactly between the ribs. A mistake of a few inches would mean the lifting plug hits a structural frame and cannot lock. While the lifting points are being prepared, the main event is being staged at the bow. This is the amputation. The damage to the forward compartment is catastrophic, but the structural connection between the shattered bow and the rest of the submarine is still strong enough to be a problem. Twisted girders, piping, and plates of steel connect the ruin of compartment 1 to the rest of the ship. If the lifters try to pull the Kursk up with the bow attached, the dangling wreckage could act like a pendulum, or worse, break off unpredictably during the ascent. The decision to cut the bow is driven by safety, but it carries its own terrifying risks. The cut line is located just aft of the torpedo room bulkhead. This means the cutting tool will be slicing through the ship only feet away from the unexploded granite missiles in their silos. The vibration, the friction, and the movement of the heavy equipment must be perfectly controlled. The tool selected for this job is a technological marvel designed by Smith International. It is a massive robotic chainsaw, but instead of a chainsaw blade, it uses a diamond-impregnated wire. The cutting wire is essentially a loop of high-strength steel cable threaded with sleeves of industrial diamonds. It acts like a flexible garrote. To operate the saw, the team lowers 2 massive suction anchors onto the seabed, one on either side of the Kursk. These anchors look like giant overturned buckets. Pumps suck the water out of them, driving them deep into the mud to create immovable pylons. Towers are built on top of these anchors to hold the pulleys for the cutting wire. The divers thread the diamond wire under the keel of the submarine and up over the deck, creating a loop around the hull. It looks like a giant piece of dental floss wrapped around the submarine. When the hydraulic motors engage, the wire begins to move. It travels back and forth, pulled by the towers. The diamonds grind against the steel. It is not a fast cut. It is a slow, relentless erosion. The friction generates heat, but the cold water of the Barents Sea keeps the wire cool. The slurry of ground steel and rubber clouds the water, reducing visibility to 0. The operators on the surface monitor the progress on screens, watching graphs of tension and speed. But the Kursk fights back. The hull is complex. It is not a simple pipe. As the wire cuts deeper, it encounters different materials. The soft rubber, the hard steel, the copper wiring, the titanium piping. Each material reacts differently to the saw. The wire snags, it binds. At one point, the tension spikes and the cutting wire snaps. The operation grounds to a halt. On the surface, the frustration is palpable. To fix the wire, divers have to go down into the cloud of silt and jagged metal. They have to rethread the system. It is dangerous work. The severed ends of the wire are sharp, and the currents around the bow are unpredictable. The repair takes time, and time is the one thing they do not have. The weather window is closing. The Russian admirals are pacing the decks, anxious about the delay. Every hour the fleet sits over the wreck is another hour of vulnerability. They switch tactics. Instead of a continuous loop, they modify the movement to a reciprocating sawing action, pulling one way, then the other. The cutting resumes. The saw eats its way through the double hull. It slices through the vertical ribs. It cuts through the ventilation ducts and the walkways. It moves from the top deck down toward the keel. For the Russian observers, watching the monitors is a painful experience. They are watching a foreign machine dissect their flagship. It is a necessary violence, but a violence nonetheless. They are cutting off the nose of the whale to save the body. Finally, after days of grinding, the sensors indicate that the wire has reached the bottom of the hull. The cut is complete, but they cannot be sure. Has the wire cut all the way through the keel? Is there a single stubborn girder still holding the bow to the body? If even a small piece of steel remains connected, the lift could fail. The force required to snap a structural beam is immense. The engineers decide to test the separation. They use the lifting jacks on the Giant 4 to apply a slight upward tension to the bow section just to see if it moves independently. The monitors show a shift. The main hull moves, but the bow stays in the mud. The gap opens. It is a clean break. The amputation is successful. The Kursk is now a headless torso lying waiting on the seabed. The damaged compartment 1, containing the shattered torpedo tubes and the remains of the sailors who died in the first second of the disaster, is abandoned to the dark. It will be destroyed later, blown up to ensure no secrets remain, but for now, it is debris. The focus shifts to the lifting plugs. With the holes drilled and the bow removed, the divers begin the process of inserting the grippers. 26 times, they lower a massive steel unit into a hole. 26 times, they activate the hydraulic expansion mechanism, locking the wings of the plug against the inner hull. Each plug is tested. They pull on it with hydraulic rams to ensure it holds. Every single one must be solid. The redundancy is minimal. The weight distribution of the submarine is uneven. The reactors in the stern are heavy. The missile silos are heavy. The computer model that controls the lift has to balance this dead weight perfectly. By late September, the preparations are complete. The surgery is over. The Kursk has been prepped, plugged, and severed. The divers return to the surface for decompression. The ROVs do a final sweep of the site. The Giant 4 is moved into its final position directly over the wreck. The massive hydraulic jacks are primed. The 26 bundles of steel lifting cables are lowered down to the plugs. The divers make the final connections. The physical link between the surface and the submarine is established. The atmosphere on the fleet changes. The noise of the drills and the saws is gone. Now it is a game of tension and hydraulics. The weather is turning. The waves are picking up, gray foam streaking the surface of the Barents Sea. The Dutch salvage master looks at the forecast. A storm is coming. They have a narrow window to perform the lift. If they start lifting and the storm hits while the submarine is suspended mid-water, the dynamic loads could snap the cables. They have to lift it fast or they have to wait. But waiting means risking the onset of the full Arctic winter. If they delay now, they might have to abandon the project until the following year. That would be a political disaster for Putin and a heartbreak for the families waiting in Murmansk. The order is given. Proceed with the lift. The hydraulic pumps on the Giant 4 begin to hum. The slack is taken out of the cables. Thousands of tons of tension build up in the steel strands. The barge sits lower in the water as it takes the strain. Deep below, the Kursk groans. For the first time in a year, the mud of the seabed releases its grip. The suction breaks. The Titan begins to rise. On the morning of October 8, 2001, the Barents Sea is heaving with the approach of winter. The waves are climbing to 10 feet, crashing against the steel flanks of the Giant 4. On the deck of the massive barge, the Dutch engineers watch their monitors with obsessive intensity. The 26 hydraulic jacks are humming, a low-frequency vibration that shudders through the soles of their boots. Beneath them, suspended by 26 bundles of high-strength steel cables, the wreck of the Kursk is rising. The lifting operation is a masterpiece of slow-motion violence. The computer control system, designed specifically for this moment, adjusts the tension on each cable thousands of times per second. It has to compensate for the heave of the barge in the rough seas. If the barge rises on a wave while the cables are locked static, The sudden increase in tension could snap the lines or rip the lifting plugs right out of the submarine's hull. The system acts as a massive shock absorber, paying out and reeling in cable to keep the load steady. The Kursk ascends at a speed of roughly 30 feet per hour. It is not a dramatic rocket launch, it is a creeping extraction. The nuclear reactor, the source of so much global anxiety, hangs in the water column. Radiation sensors on the cables and the barge sniff the water constantly. If the stress of the lift cracks the reactor vessel or ruptures a coolant pipe, the sensors will scream. But they remain silent. The reactors, shut down by the heroism of the crew in the final seconds of the disaster, hold their seal. As the submarine nears the surface, the physics change. The pressure decreases. The trapped air inside the hull expands. The engineers have to vent this gas carefully to prevent the submarine from becoming buoyant and crashing upward into the barge. Finally, the conning tower of the Kursk enters the recess, the specially shaped indentation on the bottom of the giant four. Massive rubber-lined saddles grip the submarine. The hydraulics pull tight. The barge and the submarine become one unit. The Kursk does not break the surface of the water. It remains submerged, tucked tightly against the belly of the lifter, hidden from the prying eyes of the cameras and the satellites. The fleet turns south. The voyage to the Roslyakovo dry dock is a slow, somber funeral procession. The giant four, burdened with 19,000 tons of dead weight, is towed by deep-sea tugs. The Russian warships flank them, an honor guard for the fallen Titan. On October 21st, the flotilla arrives at the Kola Bay. The floating dry dock PD-50 waits to receive them. This is a massive structure, a floating cathedral of steel capable of lifting an aircraft carrier. The giant four maneuvers between the walls of the dock. The tanks of the PD-50 are pumped out. The dock rises. As the water drains away, the Kursk is revealed to the world for the first time since August 2000. It is a sight that silences the thousands of dock workers and military personnel gathered to watch. The submarine is a black, scarred monolith. The rubber acoustic tiles are torn and hanging in strips, looking like shedding skin. The hull is dented and scraped. And at the front, where the proud bow used to be, there is only a jagged, terrifying void. The diamond wire saw has done its work. The nose is gone, left behind on the seabed. The submarine ends abruptly in a wall of twisted steel and darkness. But the true horror lies inside. As the water level drops below the hatches, the Russian investigative teams move in. The Dutch engineers are thanked and dismissed. The contract is over. The interior of the Kursk is now a crime scene, and foreign eyes are no longer welcome. The investigators, wearing protective chemical suits and respirators, crack the seals on the escape hatch of compartment 9. The smell that escapes is indescribable, a thick, cloying mixture of diesel fuel, stagnant seawater, fire damage, and death. It is the scent of a tomb that has been sealed for 14 months. They enter the darkness. The interior of the submarine is a chaotic ruin. Equipment has been smashed by the shockwave. The walls are coated in an oily black film. The water has receded, leaving behind a layer of silt and debris. And the bodies. One by one, the remains of the crew are located. They are not where they died. The currents inside the flooded ship have moved them. Recovering them is a grim, painstaking task. The forensic teams work with a desperate respect, trying to identify men who have been underwater for a year. They check dog tags, letters in pockets, and the numbers on their uniforms. In compartment 9, the investigators find the group of 23 men who survived the initial explosions. Among them is the body of Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. They check his pockets. They find the note. It is water-stained and fragile, but legible. The words that Kolesnikov wrote in the fading light of the emergency lamps 14 months earlier finally reached the surface. 13:15. All personnel from compartment 6, 7, and 8 move to compartment 9. We are still alive. The discovery of the note changes the narrative of the disaster instantly and irrevocably. For a year, the Russian Naval Command had tried to suggest that the crew died instantly, that there was no suffering, that a rescue would have been impossible anyway. The note destroys that lie. It proves that men were alive for hours, perhaps days. It proves that while the admirals were dithering and refusing foreign aid, sailors were sitting in the dark, waiting for a knock on the hull that never came. The release of the note's contents to the families is a moment of national heartbreak. It validates their anger. It turns the grief into a cold fury against a system that prioritized secrecy over survival. As the investigation moves forward, the forensic evidence inside the submarine confirms the cause of the disaster beyond any shadow of a doubt. The wreckage of Compartment 2 and the area near the cut line show the telltale signs of a high-temperature chemical fire followed by a massive detonation. Recovered fragments of the Type 6576 torpedo show evidence of the faulty weld. The metallurgy confirms that high-test peroxide leaked, reacted with the casing, and triggered the chain reaction. The theory of a collision with a NATO submarine, the story pushed so aggressively by the admirals, evaporates in the face of the physical evidence. There are no inward dents consistent with a collision. There is no foreign paint. There is only the internal scar of a Russian weapon destroying a Russian ship. The consequences are sweeping. The Russian Navy officially withdraws the hydrogen peroxide torpedoes from service. The weapon that was supposed to be a cheap, high-performance ship killer is deemed too dangerous to exist. It is erased from the arsenal. The political fallout is equally severe. President Putin, who faced heavy criticism for his initial handling of the crisis, uses the investigation as a tool to overhaul the military leadership. In 2001 and 2002, he fires a swath of high-ranking officers, including Admiral Popov, the commander of the Northern Fleet. The disaster becomes a catalyst for the modernization of the Russian military, a painful lesson that the decaying hardware of the Soviet era can no longer be trusted. The Kursk herself is dismantled. The nuclear fuel is removed from the reactors and sent to a storage facility. The missile silos are cut open, and the P-700 Granite missiles, battered but unexploded, are carefully extracted and destroyed. The steel hull, which once terrorized the imaginations of NATO war planners, is cut into scrap metal and melted down, but not all of it. The conning tower, the sail of the submarine, is saved. It is transported to the city of Murmansk. There, it is set into a concrete base on a hill overlooking the harbor. It becomes the memorial to the submariners who died in peacetime. It stands as a black, brooding sentinel, a piece of the tragedy brought up from the deep to stand watch over the city. For the families, the recovery brings the closure they fought for. They are able to bury their sons and husbands. The funeral services are held across Russia, from St. Petersburg to Sevastopol. The men are laid to rest not as missing ghosts, but as identified heroes. The story of the Kursk is a tragedy of transition. It happened at a moment when a superpower was trying to find its footing after a decade of chaos. It exposed the rot in the system, the neglect, the lack of funding, the reflexive secrecy. But it also showed the resilience of the human spirit. The men in Compartment 9 did not panic. They organized. They cared for each other. And in his final moments, an officer had the presence of mind to write a letter that would eventually force a nation to face the truth. The recovery operation itself stands as a testament to engineering audacity. It proved that nothing is truly beyond reach. The Dutch engineers and the Russian sailors, former enemies, worked together to achieve the impossible. They turned a crime scene back into a ship, if only for one final voyage. Today, the Barents Sea is quiet. The spot where the Kursk died is just another set of coordinates on a chart. But the legacy of the disaster endures. It changed the way submarines are built. It changed the way rescues are coordinated. And it serves as a permanent reminder that in the unforgiving environment of the deep ocean, there is no margin for error, and the cost of arrogance is paid in lives. The Kursk was not sunk by an enemy torpedo. It was sunk by the corrosion of a system that forgot to value the men inside the machine. And when the steel was finally cut and the water drained away, that was the only secret left to find. If this deep dive into the history of the Kursk and the engineering that brought her home meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.